Hi guys, how are you? Week 6, REL 2502. Let's get into it. So first of all, thank you for your patience. It's tempting to blame my slowness on Irma, but I think the expiration date is fast coming on that, and the bottom line is I've just been swamped. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for working with me. Thank you for your emails. Keep them coming. Look, I'm going to extend you the same grace that I'm hoping you extend me. So if you need help, if you need extensions, if you need anything that's going to help you succeed, I'm for it. So anyway, this is week 6. Now, the quiz for weeks 1 through 4 has just been posted. It is due a week from today, so the 4th, which is a Wednesday at 11:59. It's not going to cover Dreyer. It's not even going to cover what we did last week in terms of theology. It is strictly 1 through 4. So in order to study for that, just focus on the study guides 1 through 4. There's a study guide for 1 and 2. There's a study guide for 3, and there's a study guide for 4. Use that as your study material, because I pulled straight from that, putting that first quiz together. So that'll cover the introduction. The second quiz will cover some of the stuff that we're covering now. But for this first one, 1 through 4 is what you need to focus on. If you have any questions, if something's not clear, let me know. But the quiz is going to be a mix of true, false, multiple choice, and short answer. And like I said, a lot of it is just questions you gave me, and I'm giving them right back to you. But anyway, let me know if you have any questions. There is also reflections and quiz questions due this week. It's a busy week. In addition to the Christian interview paper, which is coming along, I hope. If I don't hear anything from you, I assume that means everything is great. So if that's not the case, please let me know. But again, thank you for your patience as we all get caught up. Now, today, we talked about Jesus. We talked about the Bible. Now we're talking about the theology that grows from the Bible. Theology is sometimes a challenge to teach because it's a challenge to teach it in an interesting way. Theology is such a vast topic. It's been called the queen of the humanities a long time ago, not so much anymore. But it is a huge topic. I think it's a fascinating topic, but it is a topic that a lot of theologians, there's a lot of theologians who know a lot about theology, but don't know a lot about writing. So they produce texts that are helpful, that are full of content, but they're given over to jargon, and they're given over to prose that just makes you want to fall asleep. So my task is to present theology in a way that is interesting, and there's 2 sources. McGrath's pretty good. He gives an excellent intro to the categories. We talked a lot about his covering of the scriptures last week. The next section of McGrath that I asked you to read just for last week, for week 5, was dealing with theological categories. And he covers the creeds, and he covers the nature of faith and God and humanity and grace and the church and the sacraments. A lot of the main subject matter for Christian theology. It's excellent. Make sure you read it. You will get quizzed on it. But there's a lot of really great stuff in there. He provides for an introduction, he provides a beautifully systematic treatment of these main theological topics that we're going to talk about as we move forward. We talked about creeds already as kind of a distillation of theological development, where the early church was in terms of their views of Jesus, in terms of their views of God, everything. He's going to talk about faith and what it means to have faith in Jesus and be saved. He's going to talk about God and who is God and what does that look like. He's going to talk about humanity, who we are in light of who God is, grace, unmerited favor, the church, the body of believers, the sacraments, baptism. He talks about all of that. It's very helpful. So make sure that you focus on that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to move into our next book that I've asked you to read. It's a weird book written by a guy named Rod Dreher, who's not a theologian. He was trained as a journalist, actually. But he wrote a book called How Dante Can Save Your Life. And the reason I've given you this book, there's a couple of reasons. He is walking through Dante's Divine Comedy, which might be the most famous poem ever written. The Divine Comedy was written in 14th century Florence, Italy, written by Dante, obviously. Dante goes to hell. The first section is called the Inferno, and it's the section where Dante goes to hell. The second section is the Purgatorio, where he goes to purgatory. And the third is heaven, which is, Paradiso. Obviously, the fact that he goes to purgatory is going to mark him as a Catholic writer in 14th century Italy. Yeah, he's a Catholic writer. but he is giving us the basic arc of the Christian journey, and Dreyer is following him in the basic arc of the Christian journey. So it makes a lot of sense to kind of stay with him. And doing that, we get an entry into theology. We get an entry into what Christians believe, but we also get it in such a way that is real. Because what Dreyer does is he takes this 14th century poet, this 14th century poem, and he applies it to 21st century life. And it's the weirdest self-help book you've ever read, because he takes the wisdom of the theology that he learns in Dante, and he says, how can I put this to use with my problems, with my issues? So it's a very modern story, while using a very ancient poem. He's using an ancient poem to tell a modern story. So it's something that gets at some of these major topics in Christian theology, but hopefully does it in an interesting way, does it in a unique way. That's at least what I'm going for. You can tell me if I succeed or not. So he's going to write about, so Dreyer is writing about Dante. He's writing about how Dante can save your life, how he found Dante in the midst of an awful midlife crisis. And what he read there was rejuvenating for him. So what did he read? Well, the first thing he read was the Inferno. And the Inferno it's hell. It is where the sinners go, if you will. And he paints, following Dante, he paints a picture of sin, which is interesting, which is also counter to what a lot of popular notions of the concept are. So when you think about sin, it's a word that's an emotionally charged word, that's for sure. But what typically comes to mind when you think about sin, I think some people would think in terms of naughtiness, sinful. Yes, although it's a word that's been emptied of its meaning to the point where you can look at dessert menus and they talk about sinful chocolate dessert. The whole idea of a guilty pleasure, I guess. But it's a word that's complicated, but it's a word that is often misunderstood. And Dreyer's following Dante, so he has a very different picture of sin, and it lies at the core of this book. You need to understand how Dante views, or how Dreyer views sin in order to make any sense of the book. And how Dreyer views sin is disordered love. What does that mean? Basically, he's going to say, following a long line of Christian theologians, starting with Augustine. Augustine, one of the main achievements theologically that Augustine made, Augustine was thinking about evil, thinking about why bad things happen, thinking about sin. He came to the conclusion that, sin is nothing. There is no positive element that you can call sin. It does not have a positive force in the world. What sin is, according to Augustine, is corrupted good. There is no essence of sin. Sin is only visible and only present when it corrupts good. It's parasitic. It attaches to good, it corrupts it, it warps it, it turns it into something bad, it turns it into something sinful. So Augustine is going to say, sin is this idea that these good things that have been corrupted, that have been disordered. And that's a major element of his own writing. We'll talk about Augustine because he's a heavyweight in Christian theology. But he said two really famous things. He said, my love is my weight. What does that mean? If sin is disordered love, that implies that we are going to follow our loves. We're going to follow that which we are loving. And that's going to help influence and determine our behavior. It's going to help influence and determine everything about us. So when Augustine says, my love is my weight, basically what he's saying is, I follow my love. And if my love goes to good things, then I become good. If my love goes to sin, I become sinful. So my love is my weight. The other thing he says is, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. So again, we're following our passions, we're following our loves, we're following our desires. And if they're ordered rightly, according to Augustine, they're going to lead us to God. If they're ordered wrongly, they're going to lead us into sin. So again, it's not that sin is this positive entity as much as it's a corrupted good. It's a warped good. So that's Augustine. C.S. Lewis is a 20th century theologian, famous 20th century theologian, has a lot of the same things to say. He wrote an article called First and Second Things, and I'm going to give you a quote. It's lengthy, but it really helps to get this idea. Lewis says, The woman who makes a dog the center of her life loses, in the end, not only her human usefulness and dignity, but even the proper pleasure of dog keeping. The man who makes alcohol his chief good loses not only his job, but his palate and all power of enjoying the earlier and only pleasurable levels of intoxication. It is a glorious thing to feel for a moment or two that the whole meaning of the universe is summed up in one woman, glorious so long as other duties and pleasures keep tearing you away from her. But clear the decks and so arrange your life, it is sometimes feasible, that you will have nothing to do but contemplate her and what happens. Of course, this law has been discovered before, but it will stand rediscovery. It may be stated as follows. Every preference of a small good to a great, or partial good to a total good, involves the loss of the small or partial good for which the sacrifice is made. You can't get second things by putting them first. You get second things only by putting first things first. So again, what he's saying here is this idea of you've got to have your loves ordered properly. If your loves are disordered, if your loves are unbalanced, if you love other things more than God, you're going to fall into sin and you're going to lose the joy of ordered loves. So when he says, yeah, you can't get second things by putting them first. If I love other things more than I love God, then my love is disordered. I've fallen into sin and I lose both. I lose the first things and I lose the second things. You get second things only by putting first things first. Loving God puts your loves in order and gives you a proper perspective on everything else. So again, for Dreyer, he's going to say the root of sin, and he's following all these people. The root of sin is this idea of disordered love. I love other things, even good things, because he's going to talk about loving his family and loving his father and loving his home. These are good things. But if I love good things more than I love the ultimate thing, then my loves have become disordered and I fall into sin. So when Dreyer says sin, he's talking about disordered love, and this is crucial to understanding what the heck he's talking about. So for him, he goes through a lot of suffering. He goes through a lot of difficult family drama, and the suffering that he goes through was a result of disordered love on his part and also the part of his family. He tries to keep it even. He says, yes, his family did things to him. And, if you come from a family that's less than perfect, you might find things to relate to in this story. He came from a family that did things to him, but at the same time, he did things as well to take the situation, to make it worse, to make the loves disordered, to make everything go wrong. He's trying to drive a square peg into a round hole, and for Dreyer, this is the result of sin. And again, for him, if you love God rightly, everything else falls into place. Now, again, this is something, it's a very old, this idea has a very old heritage in Christianity. Not everyone buys it. The idea that all I have to do is love God first, and then I can love my spouse, then I can love the church, then I can love the world. Some people are very skeptical when you start talking like this. But this is a very old, very traditional strain of Christian thought when it comes to sin. If you get the loves of your life in order, in priority, if you take care of the big stuff, then the small stuff falls in the line. Again, some people are skeptical. Some people say it doesn't work that way. Excuse me. But this is absolutely the perspective that Dreyer is coming from. And he's following Augustine. He's following all sorts of Lewis, all sorts of other scholars. So again, if we get into this book, How Dante Can Save Your Life, the opening chapters are the summary of a difficult family life. And Dreyer is someone who has, to put it plainly, who has daddy issues. And the way that he views his father, Dreyer subtly ties it to the way that he views God and how this works itself out. He is basically putting his father on the God pedestal and saying, this is who this is who you are to me. But the problem for Dreyer is that that's disorder. That's wrong. It shouldn't be that way, and it causes problems. It causes trouble. He is willing to say that his views about his father, his views about his family, his views about his home, go into the level of idolatry. And idolatry is just the extension of disordered love. John Calvin, who was a famous Christian theologian, said the human heart is an idol factory. And according to Dreyer, he's got a lot of idols. And they are steering him, not only steering him away from, this is important, they're not only steering him away from God, they're steering him into unhappiness, they're steering him into chaos, they're steering him into sickness. And this is another interesting thing. Your spiritual realities, if you will, how you view the world spiritually has a direct relation to how you view it, what happens to you on a physical level. And he is willing to make that connection. So yeah, his idols, his daddy, his family, his home. Meanwhile, he's kind of got an interesting spiritual story anyway, because he's raised a Methodist. He drifts away, experiences what he calls a slow, steady pull back towards the Christian faith, and it's marked by this conversion experience in the Chartres Cathedral. He's not the easiest thing to say. He goes to the cathedral. He is overcome by the desire to worship. He is made plain. It is made plain to him that there is a world that is much bigger and beyond him that he must connect to, and there's a God that he must worship. He experiences awe and wonder. But at the same time, his Christian faith is not a steady climb. There are ups and downs. There are peaks and valleys. There's ambivalence. He actually quotes another, quoting Augustine again. Augustine had a famous, this is Augustine's story too, because sometimes I think when people look at Christianity and they look at the process of conversion, becoming a Christian, a lot of times it's portrayed as this steady climb. You go up and up and up and up and up. But when you read actual Christians, you discover that this is not very common at all. Most Christians in their conversion stories have peaks and valleys. They have dips. They have all sorts of stuff. Dreyer had it. He quotes Augustine. Augustine certainly had it. Augustine's famous line, because sexual issues were Augustine's Achilles' heel, if you will. And he quotes this famous line from Augustine when he says, "Lord, give me chastity, but not yet." I want to be pure. I want to be, for you on this issue, but not just yet. I got things to do first. I got people to. Well, that doesn't sound very good, but you get the idea. So yeah, there is this sense of ambivalence, a sense of valleys, valleys and mountains, if you will. But Dreyer comes to the point where he finds himself lost, and he quotes the opening lines of Dante. And the opening lines of Dante. This is a very famous passage. The way Dante opens, he says, "Midway in the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost." And this is basically the description of every midlife crisis that you've ever read about. Or it might be a description of the dark night of the soul. What's the dark night of the soul? There was a man called St. John of the Cross, and he wrote that new Christians, young Christians, have a very strong, profound sense of God. But as you grow in the faith, ironically enough, as you grow in the faith, that sense of God's presence fades. He removes himself from the Christian in order that the Christian may prove themselves strong enough that they don't need the immediate, intense sense of God's presence. So is it simply a midlife crisis? Is it Dreyer's dark night of the soul? It's hard to say. But he quotes the opening lines of Dante's Inferno, the Divine Comedy, where Dante, the character Dante, writing about himself, says, I was basically halfway through life. I came to myself. I woke up in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. If you've ever been in a forest at night, you know what this sensibility is. You don't know the way. You can't move. You're kind of trapped. It's a very heavy experience. And this is where Dante finds himself, and this is where Dreyer finds himself reading Dante. So he says, all right, I need to learn more about this Dante guy. Dante is an interesting cat, because Dante is someone in 14th century Florence who has success, who is a leader, a ruler, if you will, but then goes into exile, runs afoul of the leaders of the city, and is exiled out of the city, out of his home, the city that he loves. He's kicked out. And as you can imagine, this gives him a lot of room to contemplate, and a lot of room to go, what is going on with the world? Why am I feeling the way that I'm feeling? So, why is the world so screwed, and why is my soul so screwed? Are the two related? And the short answer that Dante comes to is yes, they are. And he's going to explore that. And the comedy is his way to explore that. It's like there's a famous story, G.K. Chesterton, another 20th century theologian. There's a famous story involving Chesterton. The London Times was a major 20th century newspaper, and roughly halfway through the 20th century, they wanted to do a piece on what is wrong with the world. So they sent out papers to all the prominent theologians, philosophers, essayists, basically every public intellectual they could find, saying, would you please answer the question, what's wrong with the world? And they got back these huge essays, voluminous essays, going into theology, going into philosophy, going into everything. They also sent one to G.K. Chesterton, who was a famous Christian theologian, Christian apologist, a defender of the faith. And the tradition tells us, the story tells us that Chesterton gets this. He writes back, what is wrong with the world? Dear sirs, I am. Yours truly, G.K. Chesterton. So what's he saying? He says, what's wrong with the world? It's us. It's me. The darkness in my soul is the contributing factor to the darkness in the larger world. And this is exactly the conclusion that Dante comes to as well. He says, you know what? This is something, the evil that we see in the world is not just a societal thing. It's not just a structural thing. It is that, but there's also this personal element as well. And he's going to try to bring together the personal and the structural and the societal. And these two don't always play well together. And the Christian history is full of conflict between those who think that the problem is with the individual and the problem is with society. But Dante is going to try to connect them. Anyway, so he writes the Divine Comedy, written by a Catholic who has a lot to say about his church and some popes. A lot of not so nice things to say about popes, which was pretty revolutionary for a medieval Catholic writer. Because if you know anything about Catholic theology, the Pope is pretty respected, pretty revered. So for Dante to go all in on these popes like he does was a major controversy. He talks about purgatory as a middle passage. Purgatory is very controversial. Protestants don't typically believe it. Catholics typically do. Some Catholics take it literally, like there is this middle passage. There is this, because what purgatory is it's purification. It's after you die, you're not quite ready for heaven yet, so you need to get your sin burned off of you. So purgatory is kind of this holding ground while you are transformed into someone who can take heaven. And once you are transformed into an individual, then you can go to heaven. A lot of Protestants go, this is ridiculous. You die, then if you're a follower of Jesus, you die and you're immediately in his presence. But this doctrine of purgatory comes up. It's a very old doctrine. But Catholics, a lot of Catholics take it literally. Dreyer says you don't necessarily have to take it literally, but you can take it symbolically. And I think there's real value there. Because when Dreyer says take it symbolically, if the Inferno is about death, it's about sin, then the Purgatorio is about redemption. It's about healing. It's about how is that sin overcome? And how does the saint make their way, move toward God, if you will. So, it's a road to redemption. Dante, ironically enough, dies in exile, but in his exile, he writes the most famous poem of the 20th century, maybe the most famous poem of all time. Certainly the most famous theological poem of all time. So it's kind of this ironic thing, this is what happens to him, because no one would choose exile, particularly not in that era. But in exile, he is allowed to sit down and write this masterpiece. So again, it's got three sections. The Inferno does. You have the comedy. It has the Inferno, which is a section on hell, the Purgatory, and then the section on heaven, the Paradiso. Heaven is a very easy concept for most Americans to grasp. I think the numbers say that something like 94% of Americans, if they're Christians or not, believe in some form of heaven. It's very easy for us to get our head around. Hell is much harder. Hell is something that not many people believe in at all, Christian or not. I don't remember what the exact figures are, but there's a lot of people that say, I don't believe that. Even Christians, people that are like traditionalists in their understanding of the faith, are going to really be skeptical of the idea that a loving God would send people to hell. How does that work? So how Dreyer chooses to answer that question, he says, hell is chosen. This is something that is a result of your disordered loves. You are warped in such a way that you would choose hell over heaven. And then, quoting C.S. Lewis again, because again, he is on the same track. You can see a lot of the theologians we're quoting today. We're quoting Dreyer, we're quoting Lewis, we're quoting Augustine. But what Augustine says on this topic, he says, the doors of hell are locked on the inside. I do not mean that the ghost may not wish to come out of hell in the vague fashion where an envious man wishes to be happy, but they certainly do not will even the first preliminary stages of that self-abandonment through which alone the soul can reach any good. They enjoy forever the horrible freedom they have demanded and are therefore self-enslaved, just as the blessed, forever submitting to obedience, become through all eternity more and more free. So again, how do you reconcile this idea of hell? The way that Lewis reconciles it and says, it is chosen. The doors are locked on the inside. Ostensibly, what does that mean? That means the people in hell could leave whenever they wanted. But hell is the logical outworking of their character formation, of their choices, of who they have become. And Dreyer has a similar line. He says it's the chosen idea. And Dante has that, because Dante, what you're going to see in Dante, what we've already seen in Dante, is that this section, the Inferno, who the characters we find in the Inferno, they are there as a logical outworking of their actions on earth. They have chosen this path. It's not the idea of a God just kind of hurling people into hell against their will. It's the idea of these people choosing this path that leads them to hell, and they're not willing to change. So what Dreyer says, what Dante says, what Lewis says, I said it all goes back to that idea of disordered love. Where are your priorities? Lewis says if your priorities are that horrible freedom, then you're gonna. This is the road. This is where that road goes. But if your priorities are submitting to obedience, there's a very different road for you. And this is what Dreyer says as well. So he's going to talk about how this plays itself out. The Inferno was written in a Catholic understanding. One of the things that means is that you have a world that is enchanted. This is a world where angels and demons play. This is a world that's marked by the great chain of being, which was a concept that was put together by the theologian Thomas Aquinas. Basically, you have this idea of interdependence. Everything is connected. The world, heaven, hell, purgatory, it's all connected together. Everything is connected, and your afterlife is a direct result of the things that you choose in life. You get what you chose. You get what you wanted. And he goes on to talk about some of the other things. I will leave that to your reading. He goes to talk about lust. He goes to talk about wealth. He's going to talk about all sorts of things. But this is my introduction to this book. It's a weird book. It's an interesting book. I do hope you like it. The fundamental idea to take out of it, at least in the early going, is this idea of sin as disordered love. Where you put your priorities is going to determine your spiritual reality. It's going to determine how things work out for you. So what Dreyer is going to say is that what he was doing was putting his priorities on his, he was basically building idols. He was putting priorities on his father, on his family, on his home, and it was leading him down some really destructive and harmful paths. And what he's going to do is undertake this journey where his disordered loves become ordered. And he's able to focus on what matters most. So that's kind of the beginning. That's the introduction to this book. We're going to spend a few more weeks in this book. But again, that'll get us started. If you have any questions, let me know. But yeah, this will get us going. In the meantime, do the work. If I don't hear anything from you, I assume it means everything's awesome. So if you have any questions, let me know. Get in touch with me. I will help you as best I can. Otherwise, I hope this serves as a fitting introduction. Enjoy the reading, and I will be seeing you next week.